Right.
Okay, hello. Welcome. Thank you for joining the webinar. I guess we'll get started with some introductions while we wait for people to join the link. So a bit about Deta. We've got offices in New Zealand and Australia, and we work across Australasia and the Pacific. And the company was established in 2011. We work on finding energy, decarbonisation, water and sustainability solutions for clients. So I'll quickly introduce you to the panel that we've got today. I'm a senior project manager at Deta based in the Wellington office in New Zealand. And today we've got John and Glenn. So Glenn, do you want to give an introduction to yourself and tell us a bit about where you are?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. My name's Glenn Schultz. So I head up the business development and commercial functions for Deta Consulting in Australia. John and I are presenting here from our office on the Sunshine Coast. So we're presenting on Gubbi Gubbi land. So I just want to start off by paying our respects to our elders, present and emerging Indigenous people. Yeah, I've been at Deta a few years now, since the conception of the Australian office. Background in mechanical engineering and working in process plants for probably over the last 20 odd years.
Well, I'll take it from there. So I am Jon Bruce, Australia Operations Team Lead, also here in the Sunshine Coast. My history in Deta, I've been here about 4.5 years, and I've worked in the New Zealand side of Deta and more recently over the last year in the Australian operations. So really excited to have made that transition. I've got a background in physics and energy systems, and there's certainly a lot of great work going on just now in the energy efficiency space. So really excited to be here today to talk to some of what we've seen in the recent Energy Efficiency Council conference.
Great, thanks, John. Yeah, so I guess we'll just do a quick few housekeeping points just before we get into the session. So everyone will be on mute during the session, but you are more than welcome and encouraged to send through some questions via the chat question function, and I will do my best to make sure that they get answered during the session. If not, we'll find some answers to those and send them out at the end, but just feel free to pop them in there. So John and Glenn, you both attended the Energy Efficiency Council Decarbonisation Summit and the conference in Sydney earlier this month. Both kind of key events for the energy management community in Australia, where you got to hear from insights from sector leaders and discuss opportunities for the upcoming year. And Glenn, you actually presented at the conference and were part of a panel session, which is really cool. And so you were joined by other panelists from industry associations, building authority representatives, and the New South Wales government, and an end user in the pharma industry. So we're going to hear a bit more about that later on in the session. So maybe if we start with you, Glenn, it would be really interesting to hear your highlights of the event, your key learnings and kind of takeaways from your attendance.
Yeah, sure, Sam, thanks. So yeah, as Sam pointed out, the EEC hosted their annual conference, which was a good event. It was it went over 3 days, including the summit, hosted down in USC. I mean, we didn't get a chance to go around and see absolutely everything. There was multiple rooms going on and multiple presentations with varying different topics. It did have a real industrial decarbonisation a feel to it. So, in previous ones, there was a lot of focus on, say, residential and even commercial buildings, but this one kind of tried to hone in a little bit on the industrial space, which is obviously where we mostly play. So I've got a few main key takeaways I'll talk to, but a couple of honourable mentions, I guess, just to set the scene. So the opening kind of summit day was opened by John Judson from Race from 2030. A couple of key points I thought were really interesting from his presentation is just about granular data on what we need, especially for industrial processes and operations, about what they're going to do and what their potential transition impact's going to be, especially on the NEM. He was suggesting that we probably need a review of around 10,000 thermal systems across the East Coast to make some actual credible data out of it. He did make mention to some of the New Zealand policies and works that went on through the GIDI program, which we'll touch on a little bit later. Anna Scarbeck from Climate Works was an interesting presentation. First time I'd seen her. She talked a little bit about the opportunity around industrial clusters and working, having like a circular economy effect through industrial precincts to support net zero. So that was pretty cool. A lot of talk about digitalization, as you would expect. The likes of Schneider Electric had a lot of opinion and talk about Industrial 4.0, those kind of subjects, and why that would be so important to support this transition. And actually another one, most who probably attend these things would know Tennant Reid. He's the Director of Climate Change for Energy and AI Group. He talked a little bit about what are we going to do about the gas infrastructure, which was really interesting. He's saying that there's a $12 billion of regulated gas networks on the east coast of Australia, and what's going to happen to that and the operations and the upkeep of it as loads start dropping off the gas networks. Who's going to bear the costs for that? Real interesting conversations around that space. But my key takeaways were three main ones. So skills and training, that was really important. So Anitha Middleton from Powering Skills organisation in Australia talked about the massive skills gap that we've got to support this transition. So she made mention that about 30,000 more electricians are going to be required by 2030 just to support the energy transition, not let alone all of the other work that most of the trades have to take on. So she was talking a little bit about like promoting more vocational training for young people. Also talking about the roadblocking industry a little bit, where a lot of people want skilled workers right now because they've got a specialist thing that they need to try and attack. So trying to be a little bit more flexible about apprenticeship and traineeship pathways was a really good takeaway, I thought. Bit of conversation around the financial accounting standards getting changed. I won't bother going into that too much detail unless someone wants to and asks a question about it. So if you do, please put it in. But basically, the tier 1 of the new standards that are going to come into Australia are going to kick off January next year. But that's for businesses that turn over $500 million in revenue, $1 billion in assets, and have over 500 employees. They're going to be the first affected, but they're also going to need to report on scope 3s, which are going to float down through the rest of the supply base, I guess. And I guess lastly from me, the other interesting one was a gentleman called Andrew Richards, who's the CEO for Energy User Association in Australia. So he's basically he's an industry body representing large energy users in Australia. Yeah, I'm not sure John and I had a good conversation about. We thought Andrew was really practical. He was giving a good representation of what, I guess, industrial energy users are saying in Australia. He was talking about how it's actually just getting really confusing and really resource intensive to manage this energy transition from an end user perspective, which I think was a really good reality check for the policymakers in the room. He was talking about how basically the transition is actually causing anxiety for some of his members and what they're going to do about it and where they have to play and how they're going to actually start financing this is going to be a really it's going to be a big challenge for them as they move forward. He also talked a little bit about how, we obviously need to focus on those technologies that are currently available and actually really have some good policy and grants around transitioning those technologies, and leave things like the gas networks for the high temperature industries that really need them, that don't have a really clear pathway at the moment. So yeah, they were kind of my highlights, which I thought were really representative of our industrial sector.
That's really great. Thank you, Glenn. And how about you, John? What were your key highlights, learnings and takeaways from the event?
Yeah, thanks Sam, and thanks Glenn. So probably just a quick shout out to the EEC team for pulling together another well attended and well put together conference this year in Sydney. certainly worked well as an opportunity to meet a combination of generators, retail providers, policy, government agencies, energy service consultants, and energy efficiency experts like ourselves. Probably most important, some of Australia's energy users. There was certainly some interesting representatives there from industry looking to understand actually how they can go about getting on board with cost-effective efficiency programs and emissions reduction programs. So, yeah, a good meeting of people there. On reflection, there was like several good takeaways in terms of actually implementing energy efficiency, and there was one anecdote I'd just like to share for sort of example of energy saving in action, and this was the description of an ice cream factory that spends time in between flavors, pumping through chemicals to clean out the pipes and tubes. But they actually looked at this and thought, oh, if we actually create a mystery flavor, which is like a combo hybrid of two flavors, then we can actually sell this. So we don't need to clean the pipes out. And then when the pipes are sufficiently clean, they can move on to the next batch. And they were actually able to like apply a higher price point to that mystery flavor because of the excitement and what you might be tasting. So yeah, lots of great examples are out there. Another thing, just on reflection, that was raised on several occasions was the risk of the conference itself being something of an echo chamber for people who were kind of already on board with what needed to be done, and for us just to kind of all be patting each other on the back for thinking along similar lines. So it was good to see some legitimate and challenging questions coming both from the audience and also from the stage, the likes of Andrew that Glenn mentioned earlier. And yeah, some of those from the audience were like frustrated people who have heard this talk a lot and are sort of frustrated by painfully slow action. And so we're there to find the answers and some of the solutions and what's available. Fortunately, there were some really good things that were in discussion, and sort of 2 or 3 of the areas that I'd just like to raise were, well, energy efficiency. And while it seems obvious and it's kind of our bread and butter, there's still a barrier where sites really need to open up their doors to energy efficiency consultants. There are plenty of us out there. Sometimes sites are lucky enough to have this sort of role in-house if you have an energy manager in play, for example. And if so, make sure that person is empowered with budgets and airtime to get their ideas out. More than often, businesses are stretched for resources, and so there is no energy manager. In which case, let the likes of us in your site, but make sure that whenever you do let an energy consultant in, that they're not just kind of rinsing, repeating an options assessment. Instead, it's more of an engineering level approach, bespoke to your site, sort of developed from the ground up, and one that's kind of working alongside your engineering teams. So this is an energy audit effectively, and it's used as a starting point to identify and assess like the opportunities that are available. And while it does cost a bit of money, it is the first step to really unlocking those opportunities. So certainly lots of chat about how energy efficiency can be realized on sites. And we had one of the energy efficiency's perhaps greatest advocates, Amory Lovins, attending the event. And so we heard from him several times. And it's fair to say there were some really interesting examples that he was able to share that he's seen over his many years in the field. And some of these were obvious, at least to somebody with the right experience and mindset, but some were far more subtle. So it was good to hear from him. And I think my reflection on energy efficiency for sites looking to get in on this is that you may have already done an energy audit at your site, but it could be a few years old, and things have changed, technology's moved on. Paybacks have changed, so the opportunities may be a lot more attractive now, because it could have previously been based on much cheaper energy forecasts from a cost perspective. So yeah, it could be time for a refresh on that front. Another big one for me was there was a lot of attention paid to getting the design stage right in terms of efficiency, so sort of sustainable systems design. The design stage is like such an important time to get efficiency built in. In fact, it's pretty much the only time. Otherwise, you're looking at some sort of retrofit further down the line, which may or may not be able to get the capex sort of allocated to it. As a project manager myself, no project manager is going to entertain design changes during construction unless they're absolutely necessary for the performance. So it has to be kind of early stage built-in efficiency that's got to be the focus. So yeah, efficient designs are the kind of key to making those savings realized from day one. So it might be right sizing the equipment, process optimization. Are you taking advantage of energy recovery opportunities? Have you got the right metering installed so you can track things? Are you going to get this information from your equipment suppliers, who are often focused on ensuring guaranteed performance, potentially oversizing to that end, potentially also trying to keep costs down to stay competitive? So it's a really tricky piece of the puzzle, because the sites need to have somebody independent that they can trust. Again, assuming they don't have this in-house, you can challenge the equipment suppliers on the design front. And that's not always easy, but it's definitely worthwhile and should be the focus of people installing new equipment on their sites. Probably the third biggest reflection was just big takeaway was on the demand flex side of things and the untapped benefits of demand flexibility, both in how it appears as though Australia is barely scratching the surface in this area compared to, say, the likes of Europe and the US, and also in how little government funding and commitment there seems to be to make some real strides in this area. And in terms of what I'm talking about here, it's the likes of like New South Wales have a peak demand reduction scheme. There's the RERT scheme, the Reliability and Emergency Response Trader scheme. And the basic philosophy is to identify large energy users or groups of many sort of smaller sized energy users in aggregate, and incentivize them to be flexible with how they consume their energy. The energy users get paid like a dividend basically for this, regardless of whether they're asked to dial back their energy usage. But when there is an emergency or a need to respond, and they can temporarily shut down some of their systems, use less energy. It might be, say, their cool rooms or refrigeration systems that can stand being offline for maybe an hour or two. And this really helps the grid operators to manage the balancing of the grid. And another angle on that is that users can be paid to actually activate some of their on-site crop generation. Say, for example, like diesel generators are on site that need to be run up and tested anyway. If the grid demands it, they can, or requests it, they can turn on these generators, adding capacity or basically taking care of their own operations while the grid can get busy elsewhere. So it's a massive contributor to overall grid reliability. But from what I understand, Australia can be doing so much more here. And with an increasing penetration of renewable generators, which are variable in their operation, this is fundamentally essential to have the ability to be flexible with the demand on the grid. And just probably one final dimension on this flexibility is in terms of how we use the energy or how the sites use the energy. And there's a huge load available during the day with the solar, which is growing sort of as more solar comes online, and it really wants to be fully utilized. So it means that we need to kind of have more demand during the day, during those peak solar hours, to ensure that all that solar is utilized. Otherwise, it can just be wasted. And it could be as simple as only charging batteries, whether it's chemical batteries or car batteries or a hot water tank, during the day when the electricity is actually super cheap due to the abundant supply at those times. So I'll say a lot more, but I'll hand over back to you, Sam. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Yeah, thanks, guys. It sounds like there was some really interesting discussions at the events, and some practical kind of ways of getting this into reality. So, Glenn, it would be interesting to hear a bit more about what you presented at the conference and what your experience was on the panel discussions. If you would like to share that with us.
Yeah, love to. Yeah, as you can imagine, everyone listening, is 3 days of a lot of this topic. So there's a lot to summarize into a small amount of time. But I guess our part of our role in this was to provide some, I guess, some experience from the industrial sector and talk specifically around technologies that exist to help with this transition, namely like heat pumps in this particular case. So there's obviously a lot of talk. It's a hot topic of the town. We personally are doing a lot of heat pump feasibility at the moment. We've done a lot of implementation across Australia and New Zealand as well. So this was also an opportunity to talk about what we're seeing in that market. So it was good. So I was joined in a panel conversation with Adesuna Ali from New South Wales DQ. So he's a senior project officer there. So he had a real good conversation around the New South Wales government funding that's out and in planning. We had a representative, Frankie, from as a national policy director of the built environment, so more of that commercial element. And we had also Jasmine Stewart from AstraZeneca joining us on the panel, who obviously is that end user at that coalface and currently going through detailed design on this project. So on projects that include heat pumps, and electrifying some of her steam system, which was really interesting to hear what she's seeing. So I guess from my point of view, like what we presented a little bit of the history from New Zealand, sort of some of the funding that has kind of helped industry move along. So we looked at a couple of different type of projects that kind of included, and where the government investment ended up for those projects, which was quite good actually. If we look at some of the GIDI fund, it ended up about $25 per tonne government investment for projects moving ahead, and there's about 85 of them currently doing at the moment. So pretty good. We looked at some boiler mapping that we did throughout the New Zealand and how that got really granular and started to inform the grid operators and also the network providers and the transmissions and lines people, and where that kind of transition impact's going to be inside their relevant sectors. So we talked a bit about that. We talked a bit about the ISP, presented a little bit on that if anyone's keeping up to date, the latest AMO ISP and what that's going to look like. But mainly, as I say, a couple of the really interesting points was probably around Jasmine's conversations around just how she went through the process of, going through feasibility initially to a concept level stage, and what that informed the business to be able to do. That lined up ultimately with the AstraZeneca's kind of long-term sustainability plans. And then that got approved through a capital program, what was in-house, that was aside for, allowed for sustainability projects to support that corporate goal. And then she just talked about some of the interesting points that she's going through around detailed design and where they're going to end up, basically, which will be an electrified steam system, as well as a heat pump taking care of their HVAC internal temperature controls for like clean environments throughout their process. So yeah, there's a quick review of what we kind of did, and we talked a lot about like heat pump technologies and where it's really favourable in an application setting. So that's probably the summary of it, Sam.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Glenn. And I guess kind of tying those two together, like you said, John, that there's design, it's a lot easier to make changes early on rather than later down the track, and having good upfront processes like feasibility studies really makes a difference to the long-term impact. But John, what do you think makes a good feasibility study, and what does good metering and M&V look like for these types of projects?
Yeah, and Sam, and yeah, it's a massive topic. So feasibility comes in many different shapes and forms, and one of the kind of big questions in industry and sort of like putting into play these projects is like how do we run the feasibility? I've kind of had the pleasure of seeing some good feasibility being run and also some pretty terrible feasibility examples. I think great feasibility, like a good example, would be something that's based on having that real understanding that you're going to need to invest time upfront to assess the options. You can't explore every option, so you need to know enough at this early options assessment stage to know where you want to spend more time and more money in the development of ideas that are floating around. It kind of broken down like into that initial options assessment is where you're throwing your concepts on the table. In the area of sort of brownfield industrial decarbonisation, where you've got an existing operation that you're looking to do an intervention on, make a change on, like the first place is just get those options on the table. And this is the kind of thing that can come from the likes of an energy audit, where they're looking at different opportunities. Or it can even come from like an internal suggestion box or like whatever the conversations are, around the plant. But usually it takes something like a formal report performed by independent experts to actually be taken seriously within any business's like internal stage gate CapEx approval like process. So you usually need that as a starting point. And I think stage one of that, so that's the concept analysis, and the costs here are fairly rudimentary in the sort of plus or minus 50% uncertainty range. And at this point, you've made a bunch of assumptions. You've added a chunk of contingency, and there's still somewhere there's a middle range of what we think the project budget's going to end up being, and it may very well land on this figure, unlikely but possible. But nobody in their right mind is actually going to commit to saying that this is something that's going to happen with any sort of like confidence accuracy of plus or minus 10%, because it wouldn't hold up to scrutiny, and if it ever did end up going over budget, like that's the person who'd probably be in the firing line. So you kind of have these, say, 4 or 5 options on the table at this initial concept stage of development. You'll already have a decent idea of what the potential return on investments could be, and potentially more importantly, what the co-benefits are to implementing the particular opportunities. And co-benefits is sometimes something that's overlooked, but they're sometimes challenging, well, often challenging to actually quantify. So, for example, there may be a strong governance leadership within the organization towards emissions reduction, but unless there's some way of actually quantifying the benefit of that emissions reduction within the sort of capital projects being run the organization, then it's difficult to know how much of an impact it is having across the various capex projects that will come on the desk of the board or whoever. But there are, in that sort of same vein, there's many organizations now looking to adopt like an internal cost of carbon, which might be something, $50 a ton of CO2 equivalent per year, or something like this, that basically gets added in the project costs build up. So anyway, assuming you've done your concept investigations, you've put your pricing together, you've listed your co-benefits, like somebody needs to make a decision based on recommendations so that at least 1 or 2 of these concepts can be seen as viable and warranted for further development. And something that we do see is that they're often quite time constrained, and package up these concept study outputs, attach a lot of hope to them, and go straight to their board for funding requests, which is a risky strategy, but it happens. And that's usually because they're kind of constrained on the sort of pre-capex side, so the funding available to actually do the investigations, the proper investigation. And so if they are, then they've kind of got a little choice if they want to push these projects through. And normally at this point, there's still a lot of detailed investigations to go. So that happens. If it's not happening like that, then after the concept stage, which is sometimes we refer to it as the sort of class 5 level of project development, and we'd move to the feasibility stage, where we maybe call that class 3, and we take that concept to further development. We're likely at this stage to have gone out to market with your requirements and the performance spec that you're looking to work to, and in return receive responses which would include proposals on how the equipment suppliers and contractors would meet the requirements. And this would be the sort of RFP, request for proposal stage. Then you can revise your pricing based on these figures, and at this point you'd also have inclusions and exclusions from the suppliers, so you'd be able to firm up your unknowns and your pricing assumptions. You'll have an awareness of how the plant integration will go, how much downtime is needed, what kind of consenting arrangements there might be, electrical upgrades, etc. This all allows you to get to a fairly decent level of feasibility, which would be within that sort of plus or minus 25% cost accuracy range. And if the returns are looking good, this is sometimes enough to go forward with. But if not, and you're still looking to develop further, then the next stage would be that detailed design stage, where you've actually selected a design, you've selected a contractor, more than likely, and the task is basically to spend some money understanding like the bill of materials, the P&IDs, the civil designs, like what's needed to actually build this project, effectively your feed, like your front-end engineering design stage, which should cover everything enough to be able to say with confidence that you're within like a plus or minus 10% accuracy. And that surprises some people looking at feasibility, because they expect that first run to get to plus or minus 10%. That plus or minus 10% is really for your bigger projects, for like a really detailed design stage. And you may, to get to that stage, you may have spent 2 or 3% of your total installed cost by that stage. So it is an investment.
Yeah. And like I
So
said, it's got to have a financial payback from a business perspective to be like feasible to commercially to engage with. And Glenn, what kind of paybacks are we seeing on these sort of technologies in Australia at the moment, like heat pumps?
Yeah, it definitely varies depending on the application, of course, which is a bit of a pretty generic answer, right? But I think just to cap off of what John was saying there too, like the message that was coming through fairly strongly from the end users who have kind of gone down this track, and Astra is one of the examples, is that feasibility needs to be done really well to really give the business some confidence to go ahead. So it's about choosing the level of dive you want to go into, I think, is part of the summary of John's topic. And, you know, if class 5 is good enough, and that's going to give the business enough confidence to want to invest a little bit more, so they're kind of dipping their toe in a little bit just to see if it makes sense, then that's what needs to be happening. But yeah, I think that was the main message I got from that too, is that feasibility just needs to be, it's worthy of a bit of investment to get it right before going to detailed design and really significantly investing into it. So to come back to your question then, Sam, about especially heat pumps. So the broad range of it is a real rough number, is about probably about $1 million to $1.5 million per megawatt of install cost is what we're looking at the moment for I would say industrial size heat pumps, you know, refrigeration integrating kind of style heat pumps. So we're not talking air sourced sitting at the back of a commercial building. We're here talking about industrial sectors. So somewhere between that mil and a half investment in the capital front is probably around the number. Again, depending on complexity, ring main integration, how it's going to support multiple temperature processes, things like that. But that's a rough guide, I would say.
And
Just to finish off with the, you know, you asked about metering and MV.
mm,
Like people really need to understand the impact of the projects, and they need a before and an after picture to run case studies. And it could even be that co-funding has been awarded to the project that needs this like performance review after the installation. So metering data is going to be a part of the new project. And that needs to take place to bring in the M&V, the measurement and verification aspects. And you can never really have too much data on those fronts.
yeah, yeah, no, definitely. And if people were interested in kind of moving forward in this space, is there any funding support programs out there to help?
Yeah, I can take that one. So yeah, there is lots. You know, we're a bit different from New Zealand where we don't have a carbon tax, but we've got carbon incentives through basically through credit systems for saving energy or carbon potentially. So there's a few nuances around that. But if you're in the states like New South Wales and Victoria, for example, they've got white certificates, which is basically a payment when you save energy and carbon ultimately. In Victoria at the moment, their VEEC prices is like $100 a ton, which is really good, really supports some of the projects. So, but as far as when we're starting to dive into deeper detailed design and capital support, the main ones that flick to mind are probably the ARENA. So that's the federal government kind of schemes, which have been around for a little bit now. Most people might be aware of them, but we've got the Powering the Regions Fund, which is $150 million supporting regional entities who are reporting DENGA. They will support, they will do a minimum contribution of $1 million. So i.e. the project needs to be $2 million at a 50% contribution to actually put the capital in, as well as a 300K contribution to detailed design. So you've got to be past that feasibility stage to kind of unlock that. There's another program called the NIT, which is the National Industrial Transformation Scheme. $40 million fund, so smaller fund, not geographically bound, wants to be technology related, so electrifying, decarbonising, those sort of technologies, which is in play, but it is a capped fund, so once it's gone, it's gone. There's the latest one is the latest is the Victorian Large Energy User Electrification Program, which we've put a bunch out of information online about this. Deta is a registered approved supplier in this scheme, but $1.58 million to be spent in Victoria for Victorian businesses to investigate. So that feasibility section John was talking about, to investigate the options around electrification for their sites. So The criteria is you need to be a gas using, or a fossil fuel using entity, using about 10 to 100 TJs of energy of gas per year. And they're kind of, again, it's technology bound. So you want to be looking at electrifying and removing some of that fossil fuel out of the system by carrying out these investigations. And it's a really good fund, actually, because it doesn't require contribution from the end user. It's a capped amount based on the technologies going to be investigated. And really, if you hit all of the remit, you could be looking at a $60,000 contribution towards that feasibility study, which is mostly, it should cover most of the fees inside a feasibility study, of course. And only like the New South Wales at the moment has had some really good feasibility kind of investigation subsidies, and that's kind of closed at the moment. We're carrying out a couple of pieces of work for New South Wales government at the moment on that, looking at feasibility in different plants. But at the moment, there's still a metering grant available for $100,000 actually, which will cover up to 50% of the costs of energy metering and monitoring systems. So real focus on, and Ada spoke to it in our panel conversation actually, that after the feedback they've got from previous investigations that they funded, they've really seen the gap in metering. So they decided to put out this particular piece of policy that encourages industry to really uplift their metering game, and then can justify those projects to a tighter regard, basically. So they're probably the main ones out at the moment. But yeah.
Yeah, a few options out there. Thanks, Glenn.
Not as much in Queensland, unfortunately, Sam. So that is one of the issues we've got, but we won't get into that. But hopefully we see some movement in that space.
Yeah, no, and we've talked a bit about heat pumps, but I guess there's lots of kind of options out there. Not one solution is going to fit all, and it's not going to be one magic thing that fixes everything. But what do you think industrial flex kind of looks like? Are we going to see a lot more electric boilers alongside gas assets? What do you think we will co-fire diesel as gas volumes decrease? What are your thoughts there? John,
I'll have some opinion on that one, but John, you can.
You go ahead, Glenn. Go ahead.
Look, I think there's a practical way to consider decarbonisation programs, right? Like you say, Sam, like you're not going to be able to walk in. One, you probably don't have the capital available to turn around and completely decarbonise your site off overnight, right? It's not going to happen. You've also got, your production assets you need to keep doing. You need to stay in business at the end of the day. So, I mean, I'm pretty big advocate for having a viable decarb plan that kind of works in with the production growth and the business growth over that timeline, right? But we need to have a plan in place. So we're definitely seeing and recommending keeping in energy assets to help flex the decarbonisation program as well. So you might electrify, you might put in, for example, heat pumps onto certain parts of the process to just drop that load while still maintaining, for example, a steam system in play on fossil fuels. But as you work towards completely decarbonising that, it's got to work in tandem. But I do see that firming fuel still needing to be in play. And even if we reference to the AMO ISP, which the latest one's in 2022, they still see firming gas inside the plan to kind of back up the renewable source as well. So I think it's not going away anytime soon. But I think let's not, just because we don't have the silver bullet for everything, let's just not stop progress as well. Yeah, John?
Yeah, I think you're right, Glenn. Yeah, I think the thing you touched on there is that it is a transition. It's not a switch necessarily. So
yeah,
as new, maybe more electrical based systems come online, there will be a security consideration to maintain a reliability situation to maintain the existing assets, to see how the new ones come online and how they can be expanded. Yeah, so I mean that's definitely something like as a risk mitigation that the clients are interested in.
Yeah, the messaging's coming through too. You just made me think about the Victorian Large Energy Grant I mentioned before. So they're not actually asking for complete displacement of the fossil fuel of that 10 to 100 TJs. Actually, all they want to see is about 3% of the removal of your gas through the electrified technologies. So completely understanding if you're in a site where you've got to use steam to supply high temperature process, but you might have low temperature water that can transition now, which would be a portion of your load. So I think that message is also coming through in some of the policy and funding that we're seeing, which is awesome.
Yeah. I saw recently that Earing Power Station has had its life extended to 2027, in part due to that slower renewable uptake. Do you think there's any learnings from the EEC, perhaps around flexible loading, that could give confidence to the market when trying to remove some of that significant base load?
Yeah, so that was a big talking point. I'm not actually sure if the news had been announced then or not, but it certainly was in the days that followed for the Eraring power station there. So I think that's something of a signal to represent the challenges that the Australia's grid transition towards a more renewable generators is having. So I mean, this is an easy thing to do, and there's not many countries in the world who are, say, 100% renewable. So there are challenges that are associated with it, and it's been a lot slower than I think a lot of people were hoping for. There's actually connecting all of the dispersed generators. So there's like poles and wires constraints, but also, and probably more importantly, the investors who are building these plants need to know that they're going to get a good return on investment. And so there's challenges there, and people are nervous that without the appropriate firming capacity or the baseload generation that we're just going to be running or available, dispatchable as needed, that to decommission these large generators is risky. And so there's not really the sort of battery technologies at a scale that I think would allow for the likes of Iran to be decommissioned. And so that's a reflection of the time that it takes to invest, to build, to integrate all of these different technologies in the integrated system that needs to take place in order to be able to shut down these assets. So I think, yeah, that like Glenn mentioned earlier about some of the large energy users feeling anxiety about where their electricity is going to come from. That's probably a reflection of that, and that is going to likely remain, whether it's extended coal lifetime plants or even new gas assets, to allow for that firming when the renewables aren't providing the electricity that's required for the grid.
Yeah, it's a bit of a reality check, isn't it? I mean, we all would like to be a bit further ahead than where we are, but the undertaking, and if you just again look at the ISP, like that says ultimately what would need to happen to achieve our goals that Australia's signed up to. It doesn't actually say how it's going to finance it and whether it's actually a reality that it can happen. I mean, it's a great guiding point, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that. And I mentioned even the skills gap to just support the transitions here. So I think it's a necessary reality that it needs to be there and needs to have some firming at the moment while the infrastructure gets built around it. Yeah,
I was just going to say, Glenn, like it speaks again to the need for that demand flexibility, because if you can, like, say, add a gigawatt of demand flex to the grid from like having the right conversations and the right incentives from energy users, then that's a gigawatt less of generation that you need to build. So I mean, that's effectively, it's not free, but you don't need to build it. You don't need that social license to actually get that grid a generator available, connected, and so on. So it's it should be a huge push in the direction of demand flexibility. And I think some of the stats that were talked about at the conference was that the likes of Europe and the US, they have about 5% of their grid capacity that's available in a demand flex sort of way, which is huge. And Australia is something like 0.2%. Don't quote me on the figures, but that's pretty sure what I heard Claire from NLX saying at the time. So 0.2% versus 5% just shows you the way we have to go and the advantage of having that available instead of needing those additional generators to come online. So,
and to that last point as well, we're kind of the network providers have to kind of size this on a worst case scenario, right? Like there might be that certain amounts of the time we don't need the peak loads, but yet the generators have to be there to support it. Otherwise, the whole system kind of trips out, which is kind of your point around flex, right? And I think the reality, I know there's always this risk profile that goes along with, geez, I'm not going to have some other control mechanism in play that can shut down my power frequencies to my plant. But actually, when you go in and you start analyzing exactly what can flex and how it can flex and not impact production or, like product storage, for example, the reality is there that it can happen and also, be remunerated for it. So I think it's got a big place to play, but I think there's got to be a bit of engineering design around it as well, and also to give the board confidence that they would sign up to such a contract.
Yeah. Oh, well, I think we haven't had any additional questions coming in just now, so I guess maybe we'll just end with a couple of final kind of oddball questions. But how did you find the awards night, John? Was there any notable awards to mention while you were at the conference?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So yeah, that was awesome to be along at the award ceremony. There was probably one that deserves a shout out. I mean, there was obviously all the awards were well celebrated. One that stuck in my mind was actually from a company called Hoctor down in Victoria in Melbourne, and they won it for the integration of a heat pump into a meat processing site in Victoria. And just speaking to Eugen, who works at Hoctor, one of the senior engineers there, he there was a lot of reflection on how much effort it took to get that heat pump commissioned, and it's the same. It would be the same with any heat pump on any site. These things don't just plug and play. It's that they need to be integrated. So I think definitely some good reflections there on the importance of feasibility. Again, like think about how that new system is going to integrate with the existing site operations. It isn't plug and play. It's a case where things will have to be managed, and that has to be owned by the site engineering team, the site operators. So they have to be bought into the project from the beginning and ready for it to be handed over for them to kind of have ownership of. Obviously, with whoever's installed it, it's probably likely going to continue in a service capacity. But yeah, that was really cool to see them getting credit for that. That was arena funded as well, that project, and has had some good M&V. And because it's arena funded, actually all the learnings, all the lessons learned, and the project plans and things like that, like a lot of that information is actually freely available on the arena website. So yeah, probably that was my favorite award. Yep.
Nice.
Yeah, I like the partnership conversation with that one, John, because I thought that was really important, because no doubt when you're starting to take on these kind of varying, I guess, TRL levels, so technology readiness levels, projects such as this, you really need to have the partners in play, the people in the room who are going to stay on site for those extra hours and just be there to make sure it works. They need to be bought into it. So I thought that was part of the reason, right? Like there's always going to be these problems. There's always going to be little things that are going to turn up, and they're going to be pains in the ass to get the project commissioned. But if you've got the right people around you, then everyone's going to be bought in. Everyone's going to be doing their best to absolutely get it set up. So I thought that was a really good award for that one too, mate. And
yeah, no, and you're right on that piece in terms of the the ongoing relationship. Like that, effectively, if you're going to make energy efficiency successful on brownfield sites, then you need to work with the incumbent. You need to work with the site engineering teams. It has to be, it can't be some sort of far off suggestion coming in from outside. It needs to be built up from the inside out, and bring people along on the journey with you and get that buy-in to make it successful. Otherwise, yeah, you're going to struggle.
Agree.
Great. Well, there's been some really great discussions here. Thanks, guys. I'm just going to ask you both one final thing to end us for the session. How would you describe the conference in 3 words each?
The conference in 3 words. Okay. I would say networking was a really good one. I would say policy advisory, be another kind of key subjects that there was a lot of government officials in the room, so that would be one. And I would say influential as well, like a lot of different mixed businesses in the room, industry associations, consultants, others. So just really influential to talk about all different subjects and hear from different skill sets, I would say. And I'm glad I went first, John, because now you've got something.
Oh yeah, you stole my three. Yeah.
Give you more time to think of them.
Yeah, that's right, Sam. Look, I think, yeah, I'd say collaborative. So one of the things that I was really excited about was actually meeting other companies like ourselves, and there were actually quite a few that were receptive to having a really decent conversation and understanding like how things are going and like some of the strategies and so on. So definitely collaborative, informative. There was a lot of good information thrown up on the stage there by the different speakers. So great to be able to just absorb all of that in this was an intense 3 days of kind of sessions and so on. Loads of information and actually like it was fun. Like it probably is fair to say it was actually quite good fun. Probably last year's was a little bit more fun. Like there was a lady there in the EEC called Holly Taylor. She was hilarious. But like this year was equally fun. Yeah, it was great just hanging out with people talking energy efficiency.
And I'll just end on the last point is like the real message coming through was about action, really. Like, I mean, there's a lot of these events are generally policy sort of driven, and there's lots of high level conversations. And, us as industrial engineers are kind of sitting there just going, how do we make this happen? Like we want to see action now. And I think that tide is turning. There is some funding available, as I mentioned before. There's some good case studies coming out. There's some good projects kicking on. Like, yeah, I think the time for discussion's kind of over. We need to get into past the strategy planning, past the boardroom, and actually start doing some of this stuff. And that's what I'm most excited about seeing over the next wee while anyway.
Yeah, they managed to name the last session of the day how the rubber hits the road. And so that was quite aptly named. And yeah, like you're right, Glenn, like that's really what the focus needed to be for that conference. And people are ready to go. So yeah, with the funding in place and the right kind of skill sets on your site, then this can happen.
Great. Awesome. Unless there's any final comments, I think that's all yours time.
No, not from me. No, just hopefully that's a good download of information for everyone listening. And yeah, we'll see you out there.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.